How blockchain will transform the global economy? What kind of institution can be affected? What are disruptive user cases? What are the cost and benefit of all of this? Who wants to start?
I'd love to begin just by noting, you know, it's been an incredibly wild ride. Obviously, everybody's blockchain assets have basically are now on a 50% discount. You know, so I think it's an exciting time, but you know, one of the things that I think it's important for us to speak to is kind of the state of the union. So for me, you know, I think my mood is, at some level, the decentralized dog is shaking off fleas, which is, I feel like speculators who are good at buying high and selling low are potentially leaving, which isn't a bad thing. You know, and I think people who are really, really good at buying low and selling high, I would characterize those as investors, are just calm, and things are fine. So I just wanted to make that quick comment, because I actually think that it's important to try to assess where we are on the journey, because when we do talk about the global impact, I think it's important to think about this as a multi-year journey towards something that is...
Yeah, but it felt that twice so often, so why we should talk about this? Let's talk about the future.
Future, great. But you know, I just noticed that people are concerned about these local turbulences.
Really? Who is concerned? Oh, no. Everybody. I see you. Okay. So what are the fundamental drivers which will define the future?
Well, Mark and Jason, a Silicon Valley venture capitalist and the inventor of Netscape, has a saying that software is eating the world, and that things are changing from our physical world to a software world. And in the same way, software is running on the internet, and the internet has, over the last 40 years, really changed the world in a fundamental way, in that the way commerce works, the way communications work, the way even transportation works, and the blockchain and Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies are starting to affect finance and money and trust and contracts and agreements. And this is kind of the software continuing to eat the world, the internet continuing to change the world, adding more capabilities and more extensive reach into every aspect of life. And so we're just at the early stages of that with regard to crypto things, but it's happening fast, and it's not likely to slow down or be stopped.
I think it's very, I mean, I think to the point, it is very fast and furious, and the issues are, there will be lots of blips along the way. It's a very nascent technology, but the point is, it touches so many industries, and it has the ability to change, and that's this promise and its excitement, but it's also something you have to bear in mind, that it's not just being led by the private institution. For example, if you look at it in healthcare, it's very difficult for blockchain or one company to make very significant changes without buy-in from the government and the regulators, and you have to bring a lot of the different stakeholders as part of this journey, and we need to begin those conversations in this blockchain space, because too much it has initially been, we're just going to go out there and disrupt in the same way fintech talked about, just we're going to be out there disrupting and the financial services will sort of disappear. But now it's about collaboration. And in the same way, blockchain and this promise, if it's to be realized, has to engage with the stakeholders in a meaningful way so that we can actually move the discussion forward and actually bring some of the technology to the promise.
How can we engage more stakeholders with the next forum or forums like this? Can we bring more people from political forces, from regulators and so on to the stage for drummers, for videos, to bring the idea into their power networks?
I think you can begin to do this, because if I try to take the analogy that sort of happened in the fintech space to some extent, the conversation was all about disruption, and it was completely separated from the regulators, and the regulators are a very big part of that industry. If you look in the last 18 months, the regulators are joining in the conversation. They are joining in the conversation because they're creating sandboxes. They're saying, let's look at these companies, let's look at this disruption and see how we can create meaningful companies for the future. And the reason that's important, because from a regulator perspective, it's not just the impact of the failure of one company. Its question is how much of a systematic risk it is to the rest of the economy. And in that same way, I think once some of the volatility and the speculative that's in the market at the moment begins to clear, we will see emergence of this more meaningful conversation. We're seeing it in the pharmaceutical space already, where the government-led initiatives are forcing the companies to participate.
So your point is that in order to make all this growing, we need to resolve systematical risk, all right? So what kind of systematical risk this technology can bring, which we should fix in advance? Who wants to, right?
Okay, well, data privacy is a big part of that issue. Cyber, security and how that data moves, because a lot of the things talk about, data moving on the blockchain from one area to another. But many countries have regulations that say, data can't be moved out of their own jurisdictions. So data privacy, cybersecurity, there's many issues around this that we need to sort of tackle.
Are there more stronger risks than data security? Because if everybody has data open, then everybody is equal. The problem with this privacy, when some people are private, but some people have access to privacy and take advantage of it. This is the problem. But if everybody is equal, then I think that's not a big problem. If everybody have transparent their personal data, then no problem. The problem is when somebody has advantage over other people. This is the problem. So what are other systematic risks there with blockchain? What is the concern of regulators, governments?
Yeah, I'd like to maybe bring up a very unique opportunity in history. Like I'm actually an investor. I try to connect the East and the West. And I think there's a huge, huge opportunity in terms of what, for example, China is trying to do with this sort of One Belt, One Road type initiative, right? So they're trying to connect 65 countries, 2/3 of the world's population, which represents 1/3 of world GDP. And there's $1.7 trillion of investment, which is washing up basically South Asia, Eastern Europe, Africa. It's basically the whole world, ex Western Europe and the Americas, right? And representing also the highest growth economies in the next couple decades. So I think there's a huge opportunity for blockchain to play a critical role in connecting the world, right? And I would like to try to emphasize that there's a huge opportunity in the deployment of these sort of blockchain technologies in the space, because, for example, most of that money right now is going to be spent mainly on infrastructure, right? So it's basically connecting railways and roads and ports and things like that, and most of that will be hardware infrastructure connecting these places. But that is mostly, the infrastructure, plus if you're going to dig, a path for the railways, they're going to put fiber in there, right? So basically, they're going to light up the world in these high growth economies, and I think there's a huge role that blockchain can play to overlay as services on top of this, right? So things like, we'll start with things like supply chain, trade finance, but eventually it'll go to a lot of the other services, right? So I'm very, very positive about the deployment of blockchain technologies. I think we're at the really ground floor, where basically we're in sort of the early 90s, if you will, in terms of the technology aspect, but we have like sort of the 99 era hype with that. And definitely there will be a lot of adjustments in terms of how things are going on, but clearly blockchain technology is the most disruptive technology, in my opinion, for the modern era, and the ability to connect the world and all these amazing new business models, which I would include sort of this new funding form called ICOs and things like that, is really here to stay. So I think it's a very exciting time.
Actually, adding up on that, we always focus on the risk or regulation, but actually what is the biggest friction to change is actually the lack of a strong use case. If the use case is very strong, right, consumer will adopt it, right? And that's a very good point. It's like a lot of the ICOs and a lot of people are maybe focusing on payment and currencies, which is great use case. But in the same way, people thought that electricity, when it was invented, and blockchain is probably as a strong technology as electricity, they thought electricity will just power trains and cars in the 18th century, right? We realized 200 years later, still not all the cars are powered by electricity, right? Because that was not the most relevant use case. The most relevant use case of electricity was to bring the lights to home, right? And maybe for blockchain, while there are definitely use cases for payments, one of the strong use cases is supply chain, logistics, anything which is like transforming bureaucracy, paperwork, trade into a more decentralized and digital form, which will be more transparent, right? So I think that point is really one of the things that blockchain will help changing the global economy is on trade, supply chain, logistics, for sure.
And on that point, if I can just pick up, it's also a very good example you bring it together to bring about the Belt Road initiative that China has. It's bringing together a lot of countries, a lot of people, and need that trust element that the blockchain brings to bring these people together on the same way to create a business model. And I think the supply chain, particularly for us in Asia and Hong Kong and Singapore, with what's going on with the Belt Road, is a very important use case of the blockchain.
Can we kind of make it more precise, like we can try it? For example, what if we will vote for presidential election or for anything via messenger? Because our voice is stored on blockchain, we do not need competing powers, political parties, to double-check electoral process at the places for elections. So because of secure way to elect, it becomes more easy to participate. You just put on your iPhone or other phone to Messenger, I vote for this. It's very easy. So it's, for example, do we have such kind of user cases we can feel right now, like we are in the future, and something we do far more easily?
I think the problem with right now is, we recently saw Bitcoin going almost asymptotically vertical, right? And to me, that was a very scary moment, because the thing that I think as an investor I care about the most is runway, right? So I think when we talk about all these initiatives of proving the value of the use case of blockchain, like it's really about industrious people and investors working together to actually deliver on these promises. So to me, I think, for example, the notion of messenger and voting is definitely, it's inevitable, right? Because, I think Reese said it beautifully when he talked about software will eat the world, right? So I've been in Silicon Valley for 25 years. I've watched open source eat software. So to me, my thesis is that open source money will eat all proprietary money in a similar way, right? So to me, when I look for a killer application for blockchain, money is quite good because the use of blockchain relates to trust, right? So I think we've all talked about this theme of trust and the notion of trustable elections. And ultimately, when you think about the applications of trust, currency is a great application. And I think another great application is something, of course, like supply chain, which is intermediating trust. But I think everything ultimately boils down to trust. But the thing that's great about the implications of trusted blockchain is that you can actually then eliminate externalities and move towards consent, right? So I think what you're talking about with voting is about consent, right? It's basically about people registering consent. And I think that's where the revolution is, ultimately.
Yeah, so money is the biggest user case now, but I feel arguments that it cannot be working like fiat money because you cannot borrow it to banks. So I have a slide on this. Nadia, could you show it one? Yeah. So when I talk to many skeptics, they say that crypto will never be comparable to fiat because it's too volatile and it cannot be distributed through retail networks. It cannot be credited to buy something and so on because cryptocurrencies cannot be lent to banks. But that is one of the things we see is easily can be done if there is a graph chain which can process entire banking transactions, and there is a smart contract which lends money to banks and governments by regulating a rate at which it lends money. So it works like fiat. However, decisions are made algorithmically with a built-in monetary policy. Yeah? So this is the road to stablecoin, which is delivered to banking system until it exists and distributed through huge amount of retail customers and corporations with the multipliers, with monetary ways and monetary mass. So it can start to replace fiat money right now if there is a graph chain which can process so many transactions. That's what LATOKEN wants to do. Some space for ads. Okay. So
part of the concern for people like Paul Krugman in the New York Times is the notion that if you look at the dip in Bitcoin, it's almost like people were disappointed to discover that Bitcoin wasn't good for buying a sandwich, right? It's like, oh, Bitcoin, you can't buy a sandwich with Bitcoin, so Bitcoin's a failure, and now people are disappointed.
You can buy in Japan.
Yeah, you can actually eat the sandwich after the confirmations come in. But I'm joking. But the point that's interesting to me is people who complain about the features of open source software just haven't experienced open source software, right? Which is, you know, there are going to be projects that will resolve many of these issues that people have. So I don't know how you guys feel. But
we were talking about that before, but for example, the example of PayPal, right? People thought that you could use PayPal everywhere to buy a sandwich 10 years ago. If you look at if you hear what Elon Musk and Peter Thiel was saying, they say, in 5 years, you won't have any more ATM, and the banking system will be destroyed, right? It will be all replaced by digital currency. Well, that was in the 90s, right? Late 90s. So the point is that the reality is like, again, going back to the use case, is you have to make a clear differentiation between the currency, the technology, the gateway you use, and the use case. And so maybe buying a sandwich is not a strong use case.
And the word, I think people are fooled is the word currency. Cryptocurrency, right? Which and it's absolutely, you know, what Valentin was saying is perfect, right? Which is that stablecoins will actually contribute to the emergence of real currencies.
Yeah. And if you look at, for example, the case why PayPal was successful is something they didn't plan for it, which was if you had to buy on eBay or something between a merchant which is in another city or you don't know, you'll have a lack of trust and you need to be sure you get paid, right? Or you get the product you bought, right? So I think blockchain will have the same use case. It's like in cross-border transactions, we talk about shipping and logistics. Think about in emerging markets where you have people who only have a mobile phone and no banking account and they need to borrow money and land and, or, you know, buy products overseas and they have no way because the currency is not accepted in other countries. Like blockchain can have a big impact, but it will take some time. Probably like PayPal is, I think, 20 years old today, right? So it takes a bit more time than people think.
I think we in the blockchain community, particularly the investors, et cetera, have a responsibility to try to sift through in a very kind of a rational way in trying to back some of the companies that we think will, to some extent, will succeed, because we really do need to find good use cases that are demand-driven as well as and are likely to succeed. Because I think the longer the period that we continue to kind of not find the right use cases, the more pressure the whole technology comes under and more naysayers develop in saying this technology doesn't work, that this is just storm in a teacup. So we need to find the right use cases. Blockchain is not a panacea to solving everything that's out there. It is the right use cases, finding them. Maybe it's in the payments, maybe it's in the settlements, maybe it's, you know, delivering subsidies to the farmers from the government, where so much seepage normally occurs. To have that element of the subsidies going there has major social impact. So I think we need to find those really good use cases.
Yeah, talking about use cases, I think the huge opportunity, which is just on our doorstep right now, is the use of cryptocurrencies and the tokenization of real-world assets. You know, this is something that is now just in the last few months people are starting to really look at. I think is a huge opportunity. Something like $300 trillion worth of real assets. I'm working on a real estate ICO. Why? Because 80% of that $300 trillion is in real estate. And if you can, you know, in real estate, it's the most unfungible asset out there. It takes a lot of time and effort and transaction cost to be able to take that and tokenize, right? But if you can do that, as an example, as a few companies are doing, there's something called a liquidity premium, which is basically if you have two assets that are identical, right? But one asset is something that is more liquid. You can actually trade it and things like that. There's almost 20 to 30% liquidity premium that exists. People will pay 20, 30% more for that asset because of the fact that they can trade it. It makes a lot of sense, right? So for example, in real estate, if you're talking about you know, a couple $100 trillion of value, just by adding blockchain and being able to tokenize that asset, you're adding 30% of the value of that market. Is a huge opportunity. And across the board, if we're talking about tokenizing, I'm working on ICO tokenizing, you know, Chinese art, right? A lot of tangible, intangible assets going on to be tokenized and using the blockchain. It's a huge opportunity, and I think it's here to stay.
And in the real estate, there's so many inefficiencies. If you think about why would you need a property agent? Why would you need a notary public? Why blockchain could not replace even today a notary public, right? Just to authentify that the documents have been signed and properly registered, right? You don't need to have a notary public anymore, right? So real estate is actually one of the big industry where there's a strong use case. Healthcare, we talk about it. Healthcare, very strong use case. Patient identity, you know, medical records, and many other things, right? I think while I'm very bullish about fintech, and you see that probably more fintech companies have raised money through ICO than VC in the few past months. Actually, probably most of the use cases are going to be in more traditional industries.
I want to pick up on the issue of real estate, because particularly if you look, a lot of economists have said that much of the economic wealth of many of the developing countries is tied up in the real estate, and is the lack of being able to prove the access to your land title is a major handicap to the further development. So I think the initiatives like countries like the Georgia has taken in putting all of their land titles onto the blockchain has the ability to then really you know, boost the economy quite a lot, because then you have an asset that you can prove it's on the blockchain, you can borrow against it, you can then actually leverage, you know, individual people and empower them to then boost the whole economy. So I think that is a very important part. So, and I agree with you on the real estate. A lot of this can be just taken on board.
Cool, real estate markets will be more efficient, and you probably will rent rather than and buy tokens if you need exposure to real estate prices. But are there bigger user cases? What is the big dramatic change? Is it something like elections, maybe government spendings on blockchain, so they're real-time transparent, or something like this? Yeah?
I mean, I think one of the things that is tremendously full of potential at the moment, like the fragile bubble-like quality of crypto, and the reason why people assert that there's no killer app is because cryptos are used to buy other cryptos, right? So it's basically like a startup economy. But what I can tell you is that the $6+ billion that have gone into ICO is a talent grab, right? So from the Silicon Valley perspective where I live, like all the talent is going into crypto. And so the question becomes like, what future is created by that huge inhaling sound? So I feel like, you know, that's a tremendous exciting thing. I think the notion that we're all scratching the ground looking for an actual application, I'm not much worried about that. Like, I believe in the fundamentals, which is decentralization, transparency, trust, consent, and, you know, money. So like, I think all of those things are solid. We're on solid footing. And so I feel like the killer applications will all emerge. And, you know, we're not scratching on the ground looking and saying there's nothing in blockchain.
Sure, but the price of Bitcoins will only be stabilized or validated when you have a massive use case and that, you know, reach a large population. So
we just need runway.
We just need runway,
Yeah,
exactly.
and the proven user case is here. However, it's kind of, there is a bottleneck. Crypto to crypto, where is the coffee? Crypto to coffee, crypto to bread. And the problem here is that companies, coffee shops cannot put it on the balance, right? And to pay taxes, Japan adopted this, right? So now you can pay it for coffee in some coffee shops. They get this Bitcoin for coffee or LATOKEN or Ethereum to their balance sheet. They calculate the income statement, taxes paid to government. So they are legally kind of have no problems to kind of get this. And then if there will be stable coin on the one hand, and on the other hand, if companies can accept it like any currency, then this will be huge. So what can we do to help other countries to behave like Japan, to allow accept cryptocurrencies on balance sheets, to consider them like any fiat currency?
Yeah, I'll point out, you know, like I deal a lot with China, and you see some very interesting things happening in China. They basically banned Bitcoin and also banned ICOs. But but the thing is, you have to understand that this is a temporary thing. The only reason that they're doing that is because of the lack of regulation and the sort of malfeasance of people, you know, trying to take advantage of the market, right? So clearly in these areas, I think the key aspect is to be able to, one is to be able to regulate in the proper way. You already see the movement. Gone are the days where you make a couple $100 million overnight and then just to see it evaporate. People are moving toward a self-auditing sort of situation. And the other thing I think is going to be a huge trend is, like, these days, still, you see a lot of people making, you know, upwards of $100 million on basically a white paper without very much backing. So as a VC, as an investor, I find it incredible, right? We're going through that sort of you know, internet bubble era where the fundamentals aren't there. But clearly the industry is moving toward that. So as soon as there's some rationality in the market, which I would argue is happening very soon, fundamentals in terms of startup teams, in terms of business plans, in terms of viable roadmap to actually get traction, I think the market is very, very rosy in the future.
One more use case, which is identity, that relates to voting and elections and money and banking and owning property and these kind of things. And blockchain is a platform for keeping track of identity, in that there's at least 1 billion people in the world who don't have an identity. They don't have a passport or documentation of who they are or what they own. They can't vote. And there's at least 2 billion people in the world who are unbanked or don't have a bank account or a way to handle money in using banking type services. And so by creating an identity mechanism that is on the blockchain that correlates the person with the digital form, then that identity can vote, it can pay taxes, it can buy things. It's a whole infrastructure thing that will change the world in profound ways.
And I think that's very important because we have such mass migration of movement of people from the rural communities into the cities, and we lose track of a lot of these people. So they can't, by not having that identity, we can't keep track of them. We can't keep track of them for healthcare, vaccination records. We can't, get them to pay taxes. So I think, or vote. So I think that will have a strong impact. I mean, we've got 250 million people moving from the countryside into the cities. We've got to be able to track them.
Yeah, and I would argue like the first mover is things like refugees and
yes.
That kind of thing. Extremely, extremely powerful use case. But I would argue that the general notion of digital sovereignty is something that is going to be extremely, extremely powerful. So people are going to be forming interest groups, and then you can have your own currency and your own sort of identity based off of whatever is of interest. Not just the fact that you're a refugee, but things like commercial interest or interest in other domains. Yeah.
That's not so. Not such a radical idea. You mentioned it in your video earlier on that when we had the guilds of Venice, etc. I mean, these guilds weren't a national boundary at that point. Actually, most of those guilds in Norway and in the UK were actually guilds of people rather than just where they were located, and they were basically monetary unions to a large extent. So we could see that occurring with the idea of digital sovereignty.
Yeah. So what I get out of the panel that we have a very huge user case, and it could be more kind of scaled and pave the road to other great super user cases. And the bottleneck is adoption of cryptocurrencies for retail customers by accepting crypto as a fiat money. So it should be a legal change to consider crypto like regular cryptocurrency legally, to allow it to put in balance sheets of enterprises. And we need a political change for this, right? Like in Japan. So, and I'm very happy that some of politicians have started to join our forums, and Vicente folks joined us. I think you're somewhere here, right? Hey. So we will be happy to learn how the political system works, how to mobilize support base, and how to use this power base for changes and water resistance. It will be great if you share your experience. So thanks a lot for this future panel, and let's turn to power structures. Thank you.